The Ashmore estate had never been marked on official maps. It existed instead in memory, rumor, and avoidance. Tucked deep within Blackwood County, it stood beyond the last paved road, beyond cellular reception, and beyond the reach of ordinary curiosity. Locals said the house was not abandoned, yet no one ever saw its occupants in town. Groceries were delivered by a single supplier. Mail arrived once a month. Doctors were never called. Isolation was not an accident at Ashmore. It was a doctrine. Eleanor Ashmore was born into that doctrine and never questioned it. Her earliest memories were not of toys or friends, but of rules, spoken softly, repeated often, and never explained. The outside world was dangerous. Blood was safety. Family was not merely connection, it was containment. She grew up believing that distance preserved purity, that closeness meant survival. By the time she reached adulthood, the beliefs had settled so deeply into her identity that they no longer felt taught. They felt true. The men who raised her, her father and uncles, rarely spoke of morality in the language of right and wrong. They spoke instead of continuation, of lineage, of protection from dilution. Boundaries, in the way the world understood them, were dismissed as artificial constructs imposed by a corrupt society. When Eleanor inherited the estate, she inherited its silence as well. Years passed. The world moved forward without Ashmore. Eleanor remained behind, certain that stillness was strength. When her sons were born, she raised them exactly as she had been raised, without schools, without media, without names for concepts she herself had never been given. Nathaniel arrived first. Serious, observant, quiet. Caleb followed 2 years later, sharper, more questioning, though he learned quickly that questions often led nowhere. Rowan was last, sensitive, and withdrawn, a child who seemed to feel the weight of the house more than the others. They did not know another life existed. Eleanor taught them to read from old books and journals. She taught them history as a closed loop, ending where Ashmore began. She taught them that family was indivisible, that separation was cruelty, and that loyalty was the highest form of love. What she did not teach them was choice. By the time the sons reached adulthood, the estate functioned like a self-contained organism. Roles were assumed rather than discussed. Nathaniel managed the land. Caleb kept records and repairs. Rowan stayed close to Eleanor, helping with domestic tasks, absorbing her presence like oxygen. There were moments, rare, quiet moments, when unease surfaced. When Caleb wondered why no other families lived as they did. When Rowan dreamed of voices he had never heard. When Nathaniel felt an undefined pressure, as though responsibility had been assigned to him without consent. But none of them had the language to articulate these feelings. And without language, doubt withered. The outside world discovered Ashmore by accident. Clara Whitfield was a social worker with a reputation for persistence and a history of rural assignments. When an automated system flagged Ashmore for lacking updated records, the case landed on her desk. It looked minor. It was anything but. Her first visit unsettled her immediately. The house was clean but unnervingly still. Eleanor greeted her politely, without warmth or hostility. The sons watched from a distance, their gazes coordinated in a way Clara couldn't explain. She asked routine questions. Ages, education, medical history. Answers came slowly, often collectively. The sons deferred to Eleanor even on matters concerning themselves. There were no documents, only explanations. No hostility, only deflection. Clara left with a sense of dread she could not justify on paper. Over the next weeks, she dug deeper. Hospital records turned up nothing. Census data showed inconsistencies. Ashmore existed like a ghost, present but undocumented. When she requested a second visit, the state agreed. This time, she arrived with questions she did not read aloud. During interviews, small fractures appeared. Caleb admitted he had never left the property. Rowan confessed he sometimes feared the house itself. Nathaniel said, without emotion, "We were not raised to imagine alternatives." That sentence changed everything. Psychologists were consulted. Legal authorities stepped in. The case escalated faster than anyone expected. Media attention followed, clumsy and invasive, turning something deeply complex into spectacle. Headlines spoke of secrecy and suspicion. Commentators speculated wildly. None of them understood that Ashmore was not built on malice, but on inheritance, beliefs passed down so thoroughly they replace morality. When the state ordered a formal investigation, Eleanor did not resist. She looked relieved. In closed hearings, experts testified that the sons had been raised in an environment of extreme psychological enclosure. Identity formation had been suppressed. Autonomy delayed. Emotional roles confused. There were no allegations of physical violence. That, paradoxically, made the case harder. The court ruled that the sons must be removed temporarily for evaluation and independent living support. It was framed not as punishment, but as intervention. The day they left Ashmore was the first time they saw traffic lights. Nathaniel reacted with control, forcing calm onto every unfamiliar detail. Caleb oscillated between fascination and anger. Rowan cried quietly, overwhelmed by noise and space and sky. They were placed separately, each assigned therapists trained in long-term isolation cases. Progress was uneven. Some days felt like rebirth, others like collapse. Learning to choose, a meal, a schedule, a future, proved exhausting. Nathaniel struggled with guilt. He felt responsible for Eleanor, for the house, for a structure he had never chosen but deeply embodied. Caleb wrestled with rage, directed at everyone and no one. Rowan battled panic, haunted by the absence of the only world he had known. Years passed. The Ashmore estate was eventually condemned. Eleanor declined relocation assistance and remained until her death, alone but peaceful, according to the caretaker who checked on her monthly. After her passing, letters arrived. Each son received one. Eleanor wrote not to defend herself, nor to justify the past, but to acknowledge it. "I did not know another way," she wrote. "That does not make it right. It only makes it true." The letters did not heal everything, but they allowed grief to take shape. Today, the Ashmore brothers live ordinary lives by extraordinary effort. Nathaniel works in land conservation. Caleb became a legal researcher focusing on closed communities. Rowan writes novels under pseudonym, stories about silence, inheritance, and escape. They do not speak often of Ashmore, but sometimes, when asked who they are, they answer without hesitation. "We are learning," they say. That is enough. And somewhere in Blackwood County, where the estate once stood, grass grows freely now, untaught, uncontained, and finally open to the sky. Nathaniel struggled with guilt. He felt responsible for Eleanor, for the house, for a structure he had never chosen but deeply embodied. Caleb wrestled with rage, directed at everyone and no one. Rowan battled panic, haunted by the absence of the only world he had known. Years passed. The Ashmore estate was eventually condemned. Eleanor declined relocation assistance and remained until her death, alone but peaceful, according to the caretaker who checked on her monthly. After her passing, letters arrived. Each son received one. Eleanor wrote not to defend herself, nor to justify the past, but to acknowledge it. "I did not know another way," she wrote. The brothers discovered that freedom was not a single moment but a long negotiation with fear. Each step forward carried the echo of Ashmore behind it, as though the house had not been demolished but had instead followed them, room by room, thought by thought. Nathaniel found purpose first. Structure calmed him. He enrolled in courses related to land management and environmental restoration, drawn unconsciously to work that involved boundaries, this time chosen, not imposed. He learned the language of law and ecology, how land could be protected without being isolated, how stewardship did not require ownership. Yet even as he succeeded, he struggled with intimacy. Friendships felt like obligations. Love felt dangerous. He had been taught that closeness erased individuality, and unlearning that lesson took years. Caleb's path was less orderly. He burned through questions the way fire consumes oxygen. Why had no one intervened sooner? Why did the state hesitate so long? Why did belief excuse harm when intent was not cruel? He immersed himself in legal theory and ethics, eventually specializing in cases involving insular communities, religious enclaves, survivalist compounds, multi-generational isolation. He did not approach them with contempt, but with fury shaped into focus. He wanted systems to notice sooner. He wanted safeguards written not for monsters, but for ordinary people doing extraordinary damage in the name of tradition. Rowan's healing was the quietest and, in some ways, the hardest. He lived alone for years, terrified of crowds, sensitive to noise, haunted by dreams of hallways that never ended. His therapist encouraged writing, not reports or analysis, but fiction. At first, his stories were fragments, a door that would not open, a voice without a face, a house breathing in the dark. Over time, characters emerged. Names. Choices. Endings he controlled. Writing gave him something Ashmore never had: an exit. The brothers met once a year, always in a different place. They spoke carefully at first, avoiding memories that might pull them backward. Over time, honesty replaced caution. They argued. They forgave. They laughed, an act that once would have felt unnatural. Ashmore still surfaced in unexpected ways. In Nathaniel's discomfort with holidays. In Caleb's intolerance for vague authority. In Rowan's need to sit near exits. But it no longer defined them. Years later, a graduate student researching isolated family systems requested interviews. The brothers debated it for months. Exposure had once stolen their privacy. They would not give it lightly. In the end, they agreed, not to recount scandal, but to explain mechanisms. How isolation is rarely sudden. How harm can exist without visible cruelty. How love, when unexamined, can become a cage. The resulting study shifted academic discussion. Ashmore became less of a curiosity and more of a case, a reminder that morality requires reflection, not inheritance. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Rowan returned alone to Blackwood County. The land where the estate had stood was unremarkable now, marked only by uneven grass and a stand of young trees planted by the county. There was no plaque, no warning, no memorial. Rowan stood there for a long time, listening to wind move freely through space that once held walls. He did not feel anger. He did not feel loyalty. He felt closure. When he left, he carried nothing with him, not soil, not photographs, not guilt. Only the knowledge that the past had shaped him, but no longer owned him. And that, perhaps, was the greatest inheritance of all. The first time the past returned, it came quietly. Nathaniel noticed it while reviewing land use proposals late one evening. A rural development plan referenced a historically unregistered property zone in Blackwood County. The coordinates were unmistakable. Ashmore's land, now empty, now nameless, had entered bureaucracy at last. He closed the file and sat back, surprised by the absence of panic. Years ago, such a reminder would have tightened his chest. Now, it felt distant, like reading about a stranger who happened to share his name. He forwarded the document to Caleb with a single line. "They're reopening the land." Caleb replied within minutes. "About time." Rowan learned last. He always did. News still traveled slower to him, filtered through thought before language. When he read the message, he stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for emotion to arrive. It didn't. Instead, memory did. Not the house itself, but the structure of it, the way silence had weight, the way rules existed without being spoken, the way love and obligation were indistinguishable. These were things he carried even now, long after walls and corridors were gone. The brothers agreed to meet. They chose a neutral place, a coastal town none of them had lived in, a place shaped by tides instead of trees. Rowan arrived first, then Caleb, then Nathaniel. They hugged awkwardly, still learning what physical closeness meant outside survival. They spoke about the land. The county planned to build a regional archive and education center there, a place for public memory. Caleb laughed at the irony. Nathaniel nodded, thoughtful. Rowan said nothing. "What do we do?" Nathaniel asked. Caleb answered immediately. "Nothing. It's not ours." Rowan looked up. But it was. Silence followed, not the oppressive kind they had grown up with, but the chosen kind. The kind that allowed thought. Finally, Nathaniel said, "Maybe it's time Ashmore belonged to history instead of us." That night, Rowan dreamed. He was standing in the house again, but it was unfinished. Walls rose and fell like breath. Doors appeared without frames. Voices echoed without mouths. Then, slowly, the structure began to dissolve, not collapsing, but loosening. Wood became air. Stone became light. He woke before fear could take hold. The dream followed him for weeks, shaping his writing. His next novel moved beyond metaphor into something closer to truth. It was not about Ashmore by name, but about inheritance that lived in behavior rather than blood. It sold modestly. Critics called it unsettling but humane. Rowan didn't attend the launch. Meanwhile, Caleb's work drew national attention. He testified before committees, spoke at universities, helped draft early warning frameworks for closed family systems. He was careful never to sensationalize. He spoke instead of patterns, how isolation normalizes itself, how belief can become blindfold, how harm does not always announce itself with violence. Reporters asked about Ashmore. He declined interviews. Nathaniel, quieter than both, began volunteering with a rewilding initiative near Blackwood County. It felt intentional, though he couldn't have explained why. He spent days planting native trees, restoring land that had been overmanaged, overcontained. One afternoon, during a break, a young volunteer asked him if he'd ever been to the county before. Yes, Nathaniel said. A long time ago. Family? The volunteer asked. Nathaniel hesitated, then said, something like that. As the archive construction began, the county invited public commentary. Letters arrived, some curious, some cruel, some sympathetic. Among them was one addressed simply to any Ashmore. Rowan read it first. The letter was handwritten, careful. The author introduced herself as a doctoral student whose grandmother had lived near the estate decades earlier. She wrote about childhood warnings, about whispered fear, about wondering whether silence had been a kindness or a failure. I don't know what I'm asking, the letter ended. Only whether remembering helps. The brothers debated replying. In the end, they wrote together. Their response was short. Remembering helps when it leads to understanding, not when it feeds spectacle. If Ashmore is remembered, let it be as a lesson in how easily care can become control when left unquestioned. They signed their names. Months later, the archive opened. Rowan attended alone. The building was modern, open, glass-heavy. Inside, exhibits traced the county's development, its industries, its failures. Ashmore occupied one small section. No photographs of faces. No diagrams of scandal. Just timelines, land records, expert commentary on isolation. Rowan stood before it, unnoticed. A child nearby asked her parent, why did they live like that? The parent answered carefully, because no one showed them another way. Rowan closed his eyes. That was the truest thing anyone had ever said about them. Outside, the land felt different. Not haunted. Not heavy. Simply present. Rowan left without looking back. Years passed. The brothers aged into themselves. They stopped measuring progress by distance from Ashmore and started measuring it by presence in their own lives. There were relationships. Some failed, some endured. There were setbacks. There were ordinary joys that once would have seemed unimaginable. Ashmore became a word that no longer tightened the body. One winter evening, long after the archive had settled into obscurity, Rowan received a message from Caleb. I think I finally understand something. It read. What? Rowan asked. That what we escaped wasn't a place, Caleb wrote. It was an idea. Rowan smiled.